Welcome. You're listening to This Leader, the podcast. If you lead people and are seeking the transformational, high-impact secrets that will lead to greater joy and fulfillment in your work, will optimize your team performance, and will help you create a happy, highly productive workplace, then you are this leader and you're in the right place. I'm your host, Claire Laughlin, and each week my guests and I will explore the mindsets, techniques, and actionable strategies that will help you build the career, team, and organization of your dreams. Because I believe no one should have to suffer in a dysfunctional workplace. Let's get started. Welcome to This Leader. I'm Claire Laughlin, and you're in the right place if you're a leader who's ready to do the work, make a bigger impact on the world, and build the kind of workplace where people thrive. So imagine this. You're sitting in a meeting, your manager asks a question, an important one, and you know the answer. In fact, you know exactly what needs to be said. But in the split second before you open your mouth, you run a quick calculation. You say, wait, is this a good idea? Does anyone care? No one asked me. Maybe it's not a good idea. And so you pause. You say nothing. The moment passes, and you go back to your laptop. We've all been there, right? Maybe it's no big deal, but maybe that hesitation is just the surface. Because maybe you do feel welcomed at work. Maybe you do feel like you belong. But here's the question. Do you feel genuinely invited to contribute? Not just to weigh in on where to hold the team lunch, really, right? But on the things that actually matter. The processes, the problems, the strategy. Are your ideas invited to the table? And what about those moments when you have a better idea? When you can see the bottleneck that everyone else is ignoring? Can you challenge the status quo? And when you do, does anyone actually listen? How do people react? Those aren't the same question, but the gap between them, the gap represents different levels of psychological safety. And the place where a lot of organizations quietly lose access to their best thinking and to real engagement. My guest today is Janet Williams, founder of Progressive Discoveries, a leadership and culture consulting firm. With 25 years of experience working inside complex, high-stakes organizations like health plans and service organizations and systems where clarity and performance aren't optional, Janet has developed a tool called the Psychological Safety Pulse Check to help leaders actually measure and move the needle on building psychological safety. She came up through the leadership ranks herself, so she has lived these dynamics firsthand. And here's one thing Janet shares in this episode that really struck me. She asked a room of more than 100 leaders recently to raise their hand if they'd ever stayed silent when they knew the answer to the question. More than half of the room raised their hands. And these were leaders, my friends, people whose job is to help their teams do their best work. So, if you've ever felt that way, you're certainly not alone. But we are here to change these patterns, right? So let's dive right in. Here's my conversation with Janet Williams. Hi, Janet. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Claire. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. So let's dive right in here, Janet. I'm so glad that we met as our worlds intersected around psychological safety. And you are just really good at explaining this and working with it. I'm so excited to learn from your wisdom. So let's just start at the beginning here. What does it feel like to be psychologically safe? We hear these words a lot, right? But what does it really feel like? And why does it matter at work?
All right. So it is a palpable feeling, that is for sure. And here's what it feels like. It feels like having something important to say, but not having to hesitate to say it.
Okay.
Think about it this way. Sometimes you're in a conversation with someone. They may ask you a deep or an important question, and you hesitate because you're wondering whether or not you can be candid, whether or not you can say what's really on your mind. When psychological safety is present, you don't have that worry. So in practical terms, it's just the absence of that split-second calculation that you're making in your head. When it's there, that hesitation is gone. And it matters because without it, organizations lose access to people's full thinking. Like the ideas don't get shared, the concerns don't get raised, the questions don't get to be shared.
So, like, you might feel that people are self censoring before they speak up about a topic. Like, if you don't have that psychological safety or a high enough degree of psychological safety, you might get people self censoring and thinking to themselves, should I say this? I'm not sure, that kind of thing.
Yes, absolutely. And if you're hesitating, and think about it, we've all been in those situations. The likelihood is that you're not going to say that thing that really needs to be said.
Right.
You probably will soften it, or you might remain silent.
Yeah. I'm going to push back because I think about so many situations where, you know, there's this saying, I'm sure you've heard it, like brutally honest. Brutally honest. And I'm always like, well, I don't know if you have to be brutal to be honest. I think about the difference between I feel totally safe with someone. Therefore, if they ask me, hey, how did I do in that presentation? If I feel really safe with someone, does that mean I go, oh, you blew it? Let's tease that out a tiny bit, just that little nuance between honesty, brutal honesty, psychological safety. How do all these worlds collide?
So I don't think that candor and rudeness are the same. I think that there has to be a certain decorum that we always practice in professional settings and even in personal ones. I think about people that I interact with on a professional level, and if they're asking me, give me your honest feedback about how I did in that meeting, I'm never going to say, you really just did that was awful. I would never say that. I would present it in such a way that the person's listening would be open to what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And I would present things in a way that's going to be helpful for them rather than make them feel worse.
Okay. You're monitoring yourself because you're an emotionally intelligent human being, not because you don't feel safe.
Depending on the circumstances, it could be a combination of the two. So, in some instances, people may couch or cushion their answers because they don't feel safe.
Right.
Even if they could be diplomatic, even if they could be kind in how they're delivering their feedback, they still might be reluctant because they recognize that no matter how they present it, it's not going to be well received. I think that's different than sharing your honest feedback with someone, knowing that you're safe.
Okay.
And it might be nuance, a little bit of nuance there, but there is a difference. There are certain things that I absolutely would not say, even when I have the absolute best language for it in situations where I feel unsafe. I won't say it in any way. In situations where I'm safe, I'm going to be a little bit careful about how I deliver it because I don't want to make a situation worse, but I'll still say what I need to say. Does that make sense?
Okay. I mean, it does, but I think it just begs for deeper conversation because I know that there's a lot around this. As leaders, people say, I want people to feel psychologically safe. Obviously, we know some research on that. We know that the research says that a psychologically safe environment yields better things, right? Can you talk to that a little bit?
You probably already know that I am a student, if you will, of Amy Edmondson and Timothy Clark, and they both talk about psychological safety from different angles. So, Amy Edmondson talks about psychological safety as permission for candor. Clark frames it a little bit differently. He frames it as stages of permission and respect. So I think a lot of folks know that he talks about these four stages of psychological safety, but what they miss is that he posits that the organization grants folks a certain degrees of permission and respect. And based on that, that's going to determine at what level or what stage of psychological safety that they can operate within. But what both of them are getting to is that people are going to contribute at the level they feel safe to contribute. And when that safety isn't there, then silence is going to become the default. So that permission and respect has to be present. And Amy doesn't say that explicitly, but she implies it, but it's important no matter which of the scholars we're talking about. But in real life, that becomes very important. If you haven't been granted the access to or given the permission to really speak up, and that permission, if it's not genuine, you know it and you won't do it.
Love this. We've got to go through the 4 levels. But before we do that, I feel like I'm just anticipating here. I'm talking to a leader. Some of the team members have said they don't feel safe. The leader feels like they have granted the permission, that they're like, I don't understand why they don't feel safe. I tell them they can speak up. I ask them for their opinions. I want them to speak up. So, how is psychological safety built in real time? How do we build that into a relationship in such a way that it really sticks?
There's a lot to this, right? People are not going to feel safe just because you tell them that it's safe.
Yes.
The real cues around safety have to do with lots of things. One is what the leader consistently demonstrates.
Okay.
So if I'm working with, I'll just throw a name out there. I'm working with Peter, and I've worked with Peter for a couple of years. And I see that during meetings, Peter tends to shoot people down when they come up with an idea that he disagrees with, or when they make a statement that he doesn't necessarily agree with. The way in which he looks at them, the way in which he responds to them sends a very specific message to that person who's speaking, and sends a very specific message to other people in that meeting or in that room. And from that, people are picking up the clues, the cues that tell them whether or not they're safe. So Peter could tell people, hey, it's very safe for you to speak up here. But if he's responding in such a way that really shuts that down, people will not speak up.
Yeah. So, for example, somebody suggests something. He says, we've got a problem in such and such a unit. And somebody says, yeah, I know a little something about that. Maybe we should try this. And he says, we've tried that before. It didn't work. That's not the answer. What else? Something like that. So he's dismissive.
And he might be a perfectly nice person, but if he's dismissive in that way, then everyone has taken the message that this is not a safe environment. Another important factor here has to do with the institutional memories that people carry with them. In other words, I've been working with this organization for 15 years, and I hear this all the time, by the way. I've been at this organization for 15 years, and what always has been true here is they ask us what we think about X, and we might speak up about that. Then the loop never gets completed. We never hear anything about it again.
Hmm.
So it feels like, no, they really are just doing that to appease us, but they really don't care about what we think. Or anytime that I've spoken up before, I got shut down for it. Or, and I've even heard this, well, 5 years ago, when I spoke up at a large meeting, I ended up getting called into the principal's office. I got called into HR because I said what I said. So you're asking me now to speak up? I don't believe you.
Yeah.
Don't believe you. And the thing is that the organization, perhaps it has changed. Perhaps it has changed over time. And perhaps the leadership in the organization is making a concerted effort to provide this opportunity for share of voice with the team. But their belief takes a while to catch up to what the current reality might happen. So that could be part of the problem as well. It may not be attributable to anyone that's even currently in the organization. It could just be that this person has been there long enough that what they remember and what they've experienced in the past scarred them enough that they're not willing to take a chance now going forward.
I'm assuming that that can be true even when people carry their experiences from their whole life or other workplace or whatever. It's like, hey, I learned in my childhood home that it wasn't safe to speak up. So I come to work, and as much as I'm encouraged, I've decided that's not a risk I'm willing to take.
That's right. And if it's uncertainty in that way and you've had that kind of background, you're more likely not to speak up. Quick story here. I often work with these large leadership groups. And the first time I asked this question of the group, it was really out of pure curiosity because what I was sensing from the group was that they did not feel safe. And this particular organization was not at that time engaged in a conversation that was specific to psychological safety. They were talking about other things related to leadership, but not particularly that. And so, just on a lark, I asked the group, how many of you have ever been in a meeting where someone asked a question about something important, work related, a process, procedure, a system, standard, whatever it is, an important question where you knew the answer and you knew that you had that answer, but for whatever reason, you didn't answer. You didn't ask the group. You did not raise your hand to answer the question. How many of you have been in that situation? So in this particular group, there were more than 100 people in the room. More than half of the people in that room raised their hand. And at that point, I said, oh my, this is a signal. This is telling me something about what's going on, not just in this organization. I wonder if this phenomena holds for other organizations. And so I ended up posing that exact same question to about 6 different groups. The response was exactly the same each time. And at that point, I started thinking about what an important issue this is really. What is that's holding people back from this? And that's when I started to do the deep dive into psychological safety. And that's what prompted me to create that instrument that helps to measure psychological safety, not just in terms of how it's occurring in different categories, but through different populations. And I started to get granular about with whom do people feel safe and with whom do they feel less safe. It's been really fascinating to see what's come out of that.
So you had about 50% of the respondents in these different groups you looked at. About 50% people said, no, I don't speak up. But it kind of always strikes me that psychological safety is really a two-sided experience, right? It's got to be co-created between two people. Doesn't have to be a leader and a team member. Doesn't have to be that. But there's got to be a person who says, okay, I'm going to try to work on building safety and trust here. And the other person needs to step into that risk zone and be willing to take some risks. Because I'm just thinking about that. I'm thinking, well, if I'm in a meeting and there's 100 people there, I could give myself 100 reasons for not being the one to raise my hand that, in my at least quick estimation, don't have a lot to do with not feeling safe. It's more like somebody else will come up with the answer, or like, am I a person who speaks up in groups, or maybe I'm just quiet? Like, there could be a lot of reasons I hold myself back. Okay, so that was a jumbled question, but the question is really like, isn't it kind of a co-created endeavor? How do you co-create this? What do I as an individual have to bring to the situation? And what should my workplace, my manager, for example, bring to the situation? How does that work?
Okay. So around the co-creation piece, I think that there is some truth to that, but I also believe that it's incomplete. Because here's the thing. Power dynamics are not equal. Leaders have significantly more influence over whether psychological safety exists than anyone else in the system. They shape how people are treated, how information flows, how decisions get made. So individuals participate in safe, but leaders determine whether it's actually possible. So it's co-experienced, but it's not equally created. And I think that people lose that part, and it's not really nuanced. And most individual contributors, they're living to please their leader. So if they feel as if they're thinking what they say it is going to be displeasing to the leader, they probably won't say it. So in that respect, it's not co-created. Now, if we're talking about peer to peer, that's a little bit different, but I think that people have an easier time.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because when I imagine the manager, for example, I can hear some voices in my head, a manager who's basically saying, I've done everything to try to create this safety. And for example, I've done everything to try to create this safety, and I still show up in the meetings. I ask the questions. Nobody says a word. I show up in the meeting. All the cameras are off. As many times as I say, the expectation is that the camera should be on. We will have a dialogue here. I get blank faces. And to that, my response is generally something like, okay, we got to go down deeper into trust. How would you approach that?
Here's the thing, trust is the co-pilot to psychological safety for certain. And if it's not present, then no matter what you do and how many pirouettes you make and how many times you tell the folks to turn on the cameras and do all of those things, they probably won't be aligned with it. And part of the reason for that has to do with a distinction that Covey used to talk about all the time. And I often think about this. He talked about the emotional bank account. And the idea is that trust is built through consistent deposits into that emotional bank account. It's not what you do every now and again, it's about what you're doing every single day. Are you keeping commitments? Are you being honest? Are you reliable? Are you telling me the truth? Do you have my back? I mean, do you really have it? Because there comes a time when every leader has to make a withdrawal from that bank account. They have to ask someone to do something they really would prefer not to do. But the only reason why they do it is because of the rapport and the relationship that they have with their manager. And so that bank account has to have enough in it to be able to withstand a deposit. So if the account is full, the relationship can absorb it. If not, it's an immediate impact. And leaders often underestimate how quickly a withdrawal can empty an already low account.
I love that. I want to go back to kind of like the manager who has a team. They really intend to create this psychological safety. How do I build it? What do I need to avoid so I don't inadvertently compromise it?
So the first piece I think would be clarity
Okay.
and making sure that if I'm the manager with whomever who is on my team, that we are very clear about roles, responsibility, relationship, that there's a clear path around how we are going about our work, what our standards are for doing that, what great looks like, what mediocrity looks like, how we are communicating around that has to have some continuity to it. It has to be consistent around how I'm communicating about that kind of thing. And so the direct report, the individual contributor has to know what I expect and what it looks like for them to deliver on that successfully. If it is uncertain or uneven, then that individual contributor is probably not really going to trust that leader because they feel as if, on Monday, when I shared this with her, it was great. We had a fantastic conversation about it. We left, we high fived, we did all the things. But then when we revisited it on Thursday, she was someone else to me.
Yeah.
And she kind of lost it on me in front of everybody.
Right.
Now, I don't trust that. And listen, I think we've all worked with folks that operate in that way that are so unpredictable. And I certainly have reported to folks where they were unpredictable and it closed me off. And as you can see, I'm quite gregarious. I'm the person that's going to sit in my hands on my hands and not say anything. But in certain environments, I have behaved in that way because I didn't trust the person that I was reporting to.
Right. I'm hearing consistency, clarity, and probably I would throw in there a little curiosity. I always think that's a good trust builder.
Uh-huh. To encourage that. I want to go back to the piece where you asked about the leader who is encouraging their folks to share ideas, but no one says anything. Sometimes for some folks, that feels like individual contributors who are uncomfortable in sharing what they're really thinking. To be in a meeting in a group of people and to be asked to share their thoughts about things can sometimes feel like being put on the spot. It can also feel like running at top speed, and they might be feeling that we never took a walk first.
Right.
So perhaps we need to walk a little bit first and then work our way up to I'm a hack runner. I always have flow and work my way up to being able to go a little bit faster. And I think that leaders need to be able to do that with their teams as well. And there are lots of ways that you can do that. For example, people don't like gotcha. So sometimes meetings, what ends up happening is that a question's flying out of left field and the person feels like, I can't process this fast. I need a minute. So what could be helpful is, does that leader send out the agenda in advance just to say, hey, there's some really important questions that I'd like for you all to talk about during the meeting. So here are the questions, and here's some of the pieces of these questions that I'd like for you to really consider and come prepared to discuss at the meeting. That in and of itself, just taking that little action is going to yield much better results because people have had time to think about it. They've done their homework. People are worried about, am I going to look foolish? My answer going to be wrong? Is someone going to push back on it? But if I've had a couple of days to really mull it over, to think about where this fits in my wheelhouse, I can come with my deck loaded, ready to have the discussion. So even that is going to yield a much, much better outcome.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I am thinking about the kind of individual dynamics that go on, but now I kind of want to zoom out and look at the whole organization. Do you ever get feedback from leaders based on whatever? Could be that they work in a very fast moving industry or the environment is very demanding, whatever. Could be anything or nothing, I guess. But they just say, you know, this is soft. I'm in the business of results. Don't bother me with this stuff, this kind of safety stuff. This is a basic expectation of work. Like you show up to work, you show up fully. And I shouldn't have to worry myself with these things. Do you ever hear that?
Yes. But here's the thing, psychological safety is not soft. It is really critical to being able to get the best out of people, right? And to have them to contribute their best work. It determines whether people are going to tell you the truth, especially when the truth is inconvenient. The cost of not knowing what's really happening inside your organization is far greater than the cost of hearing something that's uncomfortable. If people don't feel safe speaking up, leaders are making decisions based on incomplete or inaccurate information. And that's a much bigger risk to performance than looking at this as kind of this soft dynamic. What it does, it's fuel to the engine that helps to make the organization go. You know, we have to change our mindset about that. And I never appreciated, as someone who's been a consultant for 25 years, right? I never appreciated that distinction of soft skills. If people have to talk to each other, if people have to make decisions together, if people have to perform, right, then they have to be able to communicate successfully. They have to be able to demonstrate candor. They have to talk about what's really going on here. They have to be able to give it a straight shot rather than sugarcoating everything.
Yeah.
All of those things are critically important to having a successful outcome or not.
I agree 100%. Love your answer there. Thank you so much. I couldn't agree more. But we do hear those things now and again. And I think it is important just to be able to make the case for there's nothing soft about this. It's absolutely tied to bottom line results, but some people need to be convinced. So,
Well, I'll tell you, and I'll share a really quick story. So I was talking to a potential client recently, and it was a tech company. And the person says, we really don't believe in middle management. We believe that the senior executives should be able to handle all of the people issues and they are interfacing directly. They should be interfacing directly with the frontline community. And that's how it should go. And what I wanted to say was, well, why are you calling me? Because you recognize that that layer is missing.
right.
People, I don't care how much you utilize something like AI, and AI certainly is gaining in prominence and in usage in businesses. And I think that there are a lot of businesses that are looking at it as a substitution for actual people doing the work. In some cases, that might be true. However, people will always need people. They will always need people who can really talk to them about what's happening here, who can help develop them through coaching. It can't just happen through AI. And to expect that the executive layer, which is always significantly smaller than that frontline layer, that they could just absorb all of that is crazy.
That's so crazy. So now that you brought that up, I got one question for you about that. I'm just thinking about the organizations who have done a lot to create really engaged environments, high levels of safety, all that stuff. And then something happens in the environment. Recently, we've both been witness to things like, well, of course, AI coming down the pike and changing things at a rate that people are very uncomfortable with, changes in funding streams, changes in consumer behavior, changes in environmental issues that don't have anything to do with the actual leaders in any given organization, and yet out of control. So now all this work that the organization has done to create safety is now, in my opinion, much more important, but can also be a little bit threatened because people are reacting to something that's outside of all their collective control. What do you think about that?
So I think that change is such that it's very difficult sometimes for leadership systems to stay in lockstep or keep pace with the changes that the organization is facing. I mean, that's just the reality of doing business in almost any industry. However, that said, there should be an awareness and acknowledgement of this fact that we have to operate in such a way that our leadership systems stay on par with the changes that are occurring in the organization. And so that means that we're not relegating our leadership systems to this afterthought,
Right.
that we are really looking at how do we integrate our leadership systems into our culture in a very permanent way. You know, leadership systems are always being evaluated, especially in the face of change. If we're operating in that way, then we're probably going to have better outcomes. I just spoke to a client the other day who was talking about making sure that they were able to do just that, that they were able to keep pace with the changes that were going on in their organization. They're going through a reorg and all of these things are happening. And they didn't wake up in the morning and say, okay, we're going through this reorg. What does that look like for what people are experiencing? But they started to pay attention to it when people started to fall off cliffs. You know, like they realized that there's a gap, there's a huge gap here, this chasm, and people are falling right through this, and it's creating chaos. Because if people feel uncertain, if people are feeling insecure, if people are feeling as if my job might be in jeopardy through no fault of my own, all of these things, and no one is there to address it, then it impacts performance. There's no way that it can't. Because and the other thing is that now that's taking up a certain percentage of that person's attention because they're so preoccupied around what's happening within the organization. What is that going to mean for me? Should I start looking for another job? I mean, there's all of these things that are going through their heads. And if the organization is doing a better job at addressing it and communicating what's happening and being transparent, then you have a lot less of that.
It's not going to necessarily take it all away, but that's the leadership action necessary, right? That's the proven path to at least helping to create some safety in a time of uncertainty.
That's right.
That's great.
It's a big thing.
Yeah, thank you. You are such an expert. I just love chatting with you about this stuff. And I know that our listeners are going to gain a lot from this. But let me just say that I'm thinking about the listener that might be listening to this and thinking to themselves, wow, I should pay attention to this psychological safety stuff. Maybe I don't really know enough about whether I'm doing this with my team. What advice would you give them, Janet? Where can they start to get a handle on just to get more visibility, to kind of get into this realm and start building actively a sense of safety for their team?
Well, As a consultant, of course, I'm going to say that they should take an assessment. They should assess it, really examining where are we today, because that's the only thing that's going to give you a baseline. Now, as an individual leader, you could start talking to folks about it, which frankly, I think most people, that's a very uncomfortable conversation to try to have. There should be a third party that really helps you to examine that. And from there, you have a sense of this is where we are, even if it's not really what you wanted to hear, but at least know. And the likelihood that your work communities would talk to or, complete an assessment through a third party is a lot higher than talking to your HR leader. They're just not going to do it as much. They're going to sugarcoat that and you'll continue to be in the same cycle that you're in. So the answer is you have to look at it. You have to assess it. And then based on that, you know what needs to happen. You can say, this is where the big gap seems to be. Things are great in this area, but in this area, not so much. Let's focus here.
Right. Very good. So taking an assessment, getting a read on where they are. And then I just want to go back to this briefly. I know we're kind of wrapping up here, but you did mention Timothy Clark's 4 levels. And I was thinking that in addition to an assessment, maybe just understanding what those 4 levels are could be a helpful place to start. Just kind of want to weave that back because I feel like that was a little bit dangling from earlier in our conversation as well.
So, one thing that I really appreciate about Timothy Clark is that he operationalizes psychological safety. If I was to make a comparison, I would say he operationalizes it more than Amy Edmondson does, in that he has presented these different levels. And the levels really do speak to the juxtaposition between respect and permission. And I'm doing these off the top of my head, but starting at that lowest level being inclusion safety, basically that's that first stage. And during inclusion safety, people feel like, do I belong here? Do people like working with me? Am I included in places where I should be? Not everyone should be included in everything, but in instances where I should be included, am I included? So that's that first stage. The second stage of psychological safety is called learner safety. And frankly, out of all of them, I would say that learner safety is the most important one. And here's why. At the point where organizations are in such a state of flux and in constant change, which requires people to learn new things all the time, whether they're recognizing it or not. If I'm learning something new and it's taking me a while, or I'm not quite getting it. And then there's someone saying to me, why can't you get this? Mary learned this same process last week and it took her 2 hours to get it. You've been working on this for 3 days and you still don't have it. At the point at which that is said to someone,
Mm-hmm.
they will do everything within their power to never take on anything new because that humiliation is so powerful for them. I mean, learner safety, as far as I'm concerned, is everything. So much so that when we're looking at managing people's performance or evaluating folks around performance, I always suggest that the learning aspect gets pulled out and looked at separately and handled separately. Because what's happening when someone is in learning mode is different than the mode that they're in when they're doing their routine work, things that they do all day, every day. Certainly, you can evaluate me harshly on what I do all day, every day that I've been doing for the past 3 years, because I should have that nailed. So evaluate me on that, yes. But when it comes to how I'm learning something new, use a different measuring stick for that.
So we've got inclusion safety. I love that. I think that's so, so important. Can I make mistakes? Can I lean into not knowing? And can I learn and grow in this environment? Okay, so I've got inclusion safety. I've got learner safety. What's number 3?
Next is contributor safety. So contributor safety is about, are my contributions valued? Am I asked to contribute in places where it really matters? So I'm on this team and sure, someone might ask my opinion about when we do our team luncheon, where we should go.
Yeah, but that's not a real contribution, right?
Exactly. What I want you to ask me about are things that are relevant to the work that we are trying to accomplish as a team. Ask for my input around that and how I think the process could be improved. How could we run faster and jump higher? Real things that matter. And frankly, you asked about leaders who ask the group a question and they get crickets. Sometimes part of the reason why they get crickets is because they really don't pay attention to people's real contributions, or they're not seeking input around things that really matter. And so people pick up on, people are smart, they're intuitive. They pick up on that. So that people might be thinking, well, you've never asked me about this process. And this is critical to how we do the work. And so what's prompting you to ask me now? I don't trust this question. That's another factor that could be playing into that. And that's a straight up psychological safety issue. The fourth level is challenger safety. Challenger safety says, can I question the status quo here? We have done it this way for all this time. And every single time I do this process, I run into this bottleneck every single time.
Right.
I'm close to this work.
Yeah.
Here's my suggestion about how we can eliminate the bottleneck, make this process more efficient, and get everyone through this much more quickly so we can move on to the next thing. Is it okay for me to be able to say that and to make that suggestion? And will anybody listen to me when I do?
Right.
That's another reason why people shut down because they're like, look, this is the work that I do every day, but you never ask me about it. And when I have volunteered to share it with you, I was dismissed by you. So now I'm just dialing in. I'll just do the bare minimum.
Right. This is great. And I'm so glad I asked that question because it sounds to me like I can just imagine a new leader coming into a team. And this is almost like I'm going to call it a 120-day onboarding to psychological safety, right? We're going to create first, let's get to know each other and create that sense of belonging. We belong here, we're all included. This is about us. There's trust. The expectations are clear, things like that. And then okay, let's establish some learner safety. How do we make mistakes together? What are we working toward together? How do we learn and grow? And then, of course, how do I contribute? What's that contributor level? Asking for people's input and engaging that. And finally, that challenger, like, challenge me on this. I'm your manager, but I need you to push back and extend my thinking on things and help me see the things that I'm not seeing, you know?
When it comes to asking for input, that's not a single action, right? And I think that there's a lot of organizations that do that. Oh, let's hear your input. We want to hear what you have to say. But here's the thing, this is what stops people. They provide the input and then there's crickets. So the real deal here is that the loop gets completed, that we've asked you for this input. Now give them some feedback about it. Even if the feedback says, hey, listen, we heard you. We are processing we got a lot of input about X. We are processing it and we'll be circling back to you, hopefully not on the 5th of never, but we'll be circling back next quarter with just some high level ideas that came from the input that you provided. And that validates people in their contribution. Minus that, people feel as if, well, this information just went into a vacuum. Nobody really cares, when in fact, that might not be the case.
And then they send out the next survey and it's like, nobody fills it out. I know that one. Thank you, Janet. This has been really illuminating. And I know that this is such an important and rich topic. So thank you so much for sharing all this with you. Where can people find you?
So you can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me through my website, progressivediscoveries.com, www.progressivediscoveries.com. LinkedIn is probably the easiest because I'm there quite a bit. My company, Progressive Discoveries, is listed on LinkedIn. So am I, Janet Williams. So Janet Williams at Progressive Discoveries would be the easiest way.
Fantastic. We'll list all that in the show notes. Thank you again. And I hope our listeners will go out and really make strides toward creating that safety that's so important.
Thank you so much, Claire. I really appreciate you.
So there you have it. Psychological safety is not soft. It's not just being nice, and it's not about pulling back from challenging your folks. In fact, when psychological safety is combined with strong trust and clear standards, well, my friend, that is the recipe for a highly engaged, highly productive workplace. And don't forget, If you want to actually know where your team stands, don't just ask them, assess. A third-party instrument will get you honest answers that a direct conversation, especially in a low-safety environment, probably won't. Janet, thank you. I deeply appreciate how you bring both the research depth and real-world honesty to every conversation. You can connect with Janet at progressivediscoveries.com or find her on LinkedIn. The links are in the show notes. So here's what I want to leave you with. Think about the ways that you are inviting or subtly uninviting the people on your team to engage. There may be room in there for you to reach out and open doors. Those are your entry points. If this episode landed for you, share it with a leader who needs to hear it, and be sure to follow so you don't miss what's coming next. Until then, lead the way.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode. To learn more about my services and for lots of free resources and additional tools to enrich your journey, visit my website and subscribe to my newsletter at clairelaughlin.com. If you have a question about leadership, teams, or organizational culture you'd like me to address on the podcast, please reach out to me at support@clairelaughlin.com and connect with me on social channels at Claire Laughlin Consulting. Until next time, lead the way.